All right, welcome everyone to the first edition of Carvel Office Hours. We're going to be starting these every second and fourth Thursday of the month, 11:30 a.m. Pacific time, 2:30 p.m. Eastern time. If there's anything that you wish to discuss, or if there's anything that you're curious about for Carvel, we invite you to attend these, and it's just an open discussion and just open help with anything that you want to bring to the Carvel team. Just a reminder that this is being recorded and to please adhere to the code of conduct when attending these meetings. Erin, should I go ahead and bring it off to you to drive the rest of the way, or is Erin here? Oh, Helen, do you want to drive or do you want me to drive?
I don't think Erin's here. I think we can start with the cap issue that we have listed on the HackMD there. So it's a cap issue number 11. If you pull that up, it's about providing a way to add custom weighting functionality for resource types. And I think we still have pending discussions on this to decide on a approach how to solve this particular problem. So yeah. And I'll leave it open for I guess the engineers to talk through this particular issue here.
Okay, you said start with the top one.
The cap 11. Yes.
Oh, sorry.
Thanks.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. All right. Who wants to get started with this?
I can help talk to this, kind of tee off what the need is here and what's going on. So in general, Kubernetes wants you to report the status of your resources in a particular way. But I think, like, to keep it short, like, largely not everything's doing that. And so the question becomes, well, how do you help out the operator when they're dealing with a third-party component that isn't behaving the way that it should to spec, and give the person who's at the switch a way to try and reconcile that. So if the status is not a condition status, like, what can they do? How can they, like, point at, well, it's actually over here. This value over here, or maybe on another resource would be a sufficient proxy for me to be able to indicate that a particular resource is available. And this affects the way CAP operates, because CAP will figure out, okay, well, what are the dependencies between the resources, and the resources that don't have any dependencies or dependents will get applied. And it's going to wait until that resource is ready, until it moves on to the next part. And so this is about helping fulfill that weighting algorithm with an alternative strategy than the spec strategy for how to do that for resources. There's been some comments and stuff, so there's more detail if you want to scroll. Yeah.
One kind of a concern I have, this is actually I'll get to that in a second. One concern I have here is, because we are expanding our, let's say, ways of checking on stuff, right? So right now we only check on conditions, right? And you get to specify what condition means what, kind of a thing, right? One kind of concern I have is that we start introducing variety of different ways of how to check on things. And I'm sure there's always going to be yet another person who comes in and says, well, I want this particular logic, right? I want, if this field X is value Y, and I don't know, some other field is something else, then do something, right? And what to me that kind of signals to is that because this is a more advanced case scenario, we should probably consider providing a solution that solves all of the possible cases in bulk, right? And by that, I mean a fairly specific approach. And that approach is really just providing programmatic access to defining what does that mean for this resource to be, I don't know, reconciled successfully or something like that, right? And I think from previous conversations I've had with various folks, one option that has that clear full potential is ability to specify a function, like a YTT function, that describes what does that mean for a resource to be, you know, complete. Now, one interesting thing about this is that, you know, this is not YTT function and YTT templates. This is just using YTT execution library, right, within a different tool like CAP, right? So this is just effectively using the YTT Starlark functionality in CAP, right? And so I think that by providing this low level approach, we effectively cover various advanced cases, right, that are going to be extremely hard to implement in any kind of a YAML structure and thing, right? Because at some point you start effectively representing code as YAML, right? And I think that's a very kind of that's a very difficult and not great territory to be in, where suddenly your YAML starts looking like, I don't know, if conditionals and structures and whatever. So yeah, so that's one of my opinions. There's actually maybe semi-related topics that there's actually other places where I think this kind of functionality will be beneficial to CAP. And actually yesterday it came up as one of the possibilities in the image package where we could be using the execution environment in a particular context. The other example in CAP might be as deciding how to programmatically rebase something, right? Because today the rebase is very basic. It's like either pick from one location or pick from another location, right? Versus it could be a little bit more complicated, right? Where for whatever reasons you may want to rebase based on some other configurations or conditions like that, right? And so again, providing the YTT execution environment would be very handy there.
I think one thing there could be taking like vetting an approach like that would be like taking the expression that Dustin had here, for example, and looking at to see what would that look like if that were the execution context. So like how would this JSON path translate to a YTT expression?
Yeah, and I could imagine, you know, just kind of a, you know, roughly speaking, there would be a function that takes that resource, which could be our YAML fragment or something, right? And you're able to access whatever you need to access and use conditionals if you need to use conditionals, and just later on return a Boolean whether something is, or maybe it's not even a Boolean, you know, maybe it's actually a triple value, kind of a succeeded, failed, and uncertain yet, right? With additional messaging capabilities where you can actually provide something useful to the user.
Mm. What are some of the other possible use cases here? So this one is just talking about elsewhere on the resource. This is no, go look at this other field, not the condition status. Like, what are some of the other possibilities that we would want to cover that helps justify having a more generalized execution environment? I mean, are there cases where like some resources depend on other resources?
So today, one of the hard-coded weighting principles in CAP is actually, and by the way, this is an interesting kind of a thing, is a lot of the CAP configuration is really pulled out into this kind of like a default configuration, right? The weighting logic today is actually hard-coded in CAP itself, so it's not a configuration item, like the native weighting, like if we want to wait for a pod or something like that, right? You could imagine potentially pulling out some of that logic, you know, into a configuration. But the point that I'm trying to make here is, or really I'm trying to answer the question here is there is a case for deployments, I think, where it actually waits for replica sets or something like that. I forget what it is, right? And so it actually looks at a different object to kind of get a better view on what it is. Now, I would generally say that this is an anti-pattern for us because we don't want to be pulling out random objects out of a cluster just because you're waiting on one object. And arguably, this should be maybe an anti-pattern for kind of how you structure your operators or whatnot. But that's at least one case that spans multiple resources. But I'm not sure we need to get that crazy in making this functionality that powerful, right? Because then you start getting into a question, well, how do I know which resources to pull for evaluation, right? For this whatever procedure, right? But there are other, you know, controllers out there that, you know, don't necessarily indicate status via conditions, right? They indicate status via maybe some, like, actually, I guess technically stateful set doesn't have conditions, right? Because it's such old resource, so they've never added conditions. It has, you know, logic about like based on the status that this number, status that another number, and how that kind of compares to each other. Or another example might be services. Services have, I think, a particular field set, and if that particular field is not set, then it's waiting for a particular other field to show up in the status. I think it's like a load balancer IP or something like that. So that logic is already hard-coded in CAP, but it would be interesting to be able to pull that out as a configuration thing, just to say that, hey, we're not really coupled. Like whatever we need to do, other users are able to do with their resources as well.
I would agree with that. It's like the YTT looks interesting, but in the end, it feels like maybe it's too much to allow people to have Starlark, because what are we expecting them to wait on, right? So we talked about we expect them to wait on something particular on a particular resource, right? Like some field of a particular value. And that's basically it, right? Or to wait on a set of particular values on a particular resource, correct? So like that, I'm not sure, like in one hand, it feels very appealing, but in the other hand, it feels like also maybe it's too much.
So I'm not sure when you say wait, right? Because we're not like for, let me see if I can find service, Core V1 service, for example. So here is like the logic. Oh, come on, why is my Zoom so slow today? Here's the link in Zoom chat for logic that the service itself, this is how we wait for a service, right? So it's not really waiting on any field. It's really a combination of things, and some of those things are conditional. I think just by nature of how Kubernetes APIs are, they're they're really, there are multiple actors in the system, right? And they're ultimately working with the same data structure, right? Conditions is definitely a preferred way for folks to describe what to wait for. But I think once you go beyond condition, it's really there's all kinds of ways, right? Like you could probably come up with lots of different examples out there in open source how people start waiting or deciding to wait on certain things, right? And this also might be very much environment specific, right? Like for some customers, they want to do very particular thing for a particular resource compared to like how we would want to wait for some other thing.
Like the only thing that I was thinking before was that what happens if you have an OR statement, right? And I think that's the part that's going to become more complicated is if you, on your waiting rules, you have ands and ors. At the same time, that's like the case that you provided with the service. It's just like a bunch of ands and ors, right? So I think that would be like the part that it would be interesting. Like it would make it easier, maybe, on if we have some sort of like a programming language to do this. But it feels a little bit strange to allow you to program a YAML file.
I mean, this is where I kind of started with, right? Like, I don't think we want to be creating programming language in YAML since we already know very well that there is it takes effort, and we also have already a good investment, for example, in Starlark inside YTT that we could just repurpose.
And I'm thinking about that move of where it's like, okay, there's complexity in the code, sort of like a core principle of like simplify the code by pushing complexity into data is sort of one way to think about the waiting logic as a separate expression. And so it would simplify this. It would basically be like, get me the rule for a service and evaluate. That's what this code would end up looking like. In fact, sort of more generally, it'd just be for that service, evaluate its waiting logic. And we would have extracted this as a default rule. And so I feel like looking at that way, it basically sets up the general spirit of the request, which is, hey, I have this thing that's just outside of what the Kubernetes API spec calls for, and need to be able to break the glass to work around that. So as long as it doesn't make cases like the simple cases painful, like hard, then you kind of get the best of all worlds. Like the tool becomes more focused and simple in its own right. Those rules are then more general. And then as a user, if I absolutely need to, I have the ability to narrowly express the wait condition or more broadly, just depending on my needs.
I like that you mentioned a phrase, break the glass, because this is to a certain extent similar to, to like YTT overlays, right? YTT overlays themselves provide that advanced capability for end users to say, you know what, I know better. This is a very special maybe case. I'd like to do the thing that I know I want to do. And to me, this is kind of similar to this, like where to a certain extent, once you kind of move off the conditions, right, you're just in open land. And so then really one of the questions then just comes up is like, why would we try to prevent a user from setting up whatever logic they want to set up, right? Why wouldn't we let them just say, do whatever you want to do, right?
Yeah, and I don't think there's anything that prevents, like if you have that more generalized mechanism in place, just like using the ATM, you can get as much cash as you want within limits. But there's also that like, give me the 40 bucks fast button. So we could also provide the ability where it's like, hey, you have this like really common case of where it's just another field on the same resource and you just need to be able to provide an expression to do that. We could also provide a convenience, eventually provide like a convenience interface for that. If that becomes like a common, that we see like, oh, that's a regular thing. Why should you have to go through the whole learning curve to like figure out what is this world you're participating in? If we can just provide you a string, not unlike the way that Dustin illustrated here with the field query, figure out how to work in a more convenience UI on top of it.
I think my argument is that the quick $40 button is the conditions. That is the, you know, vast majority of how, you know, operators, you know, express that particular resource as at a particular stage, right? We do have that mechanism, custom DSL, right, to specify this condition means success, this condition means failure, blah 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 blah.
Almost. I don't think it's exact. I think it's more like the buddy who goes into the store to get the money for you. Like you give them your card and the pin and they go do it and you come back and they got money. This is where it's like it's case right after that where it's just like doesn't quite align it. You need to get involved. You're not going to give your pin to your buddy. You need that money quick.
I think I just want to say a couple things real quick. I only got a few minutes and I got to drop for a customer call, but I think the intent of this was, although status.conditions is a known and documented best practice, even an upstream project like Cube Builder, which a lot of controllers are built off of, did not introduce status.conditions until about, I don't know, 6-7 months ago. So anything prior to 6 or 7 months ago is going to have potentially problems with status.conditions in the actual field in the real world. Understood that yes, status.conditions is a known best practice at this time, but like there's still stuff running out there that people aren't going to be able to change. So that's the comment number one I would make, and that's the whole reason for this discussion. Comment number two is I would make is, me personally as a consumer of this, I would not want to have to write some complicated YTT or Starlark to be able to do what I need to do. To me, that's hindering the user experience of this thing. I would want some sort of simple string query. It doesn't have to be JSON path, but that was just the first thing that came to mind. But just some simple string query that that I could put in and be able to tell it that this is the correct condition that this thing needs to be in. So those are the two thoughts off the top of my head, just coming from an outside consumer perspective.
And Dustin, has it been your experience that like it's a field on the same resource? Like how often is it that versus some other resource?
From what I've generally seen, it's a field on the same resource. Like I need to wait for, you know, I got a custom resource definition, I've created that, and now there's some sort of field on that same resource that I can look for. So that's generally my experiences, but I can't say that that's going to cover all of them either. That's actually at least how Cube Builder has done it in the past.
So don't quote me on that, but I'm having a hard time I'm having a hard time believing that Cube Builder. Well, I'm actually not quite sure how Cube Builder would even play into this, right? Because Cube Builder is just setting out a bunch of stuff, right, for your operator. Right? I don't think there's anything that Cube Builder needs to do to enable use of conditions, because it's just a random field on a status. Like it's not in any part. It's not special in any way compared to all the other fields. So I'm not sure there is actually. I'm sure there are other controllers out there that just happen not to use conditions, but conditions has been like part of the convention in Kubernetes for a long time, right? So I'm not sure how common this is to not have conditions now. But even so, even if we go, it's common, right? If that's common, that probably means that there's other cases that are also common, like the services case.
Yeah, my reference to Queue Builder was mainly to outline the fact that a lot of operators and controllers out there have been built off of Queue Builder, and if Queue Builder didn't have that functionality until fairly recently, then a lot of operators and controllers are going to exist out there without status.conditions. So if they go to use CAP and try to apply a custom resource, they're not going to be able to do it because right now it's you have to have status.conditions. That was just my whole point there.
I think what Dustin means is that previously, if you wanted to use conditions, you had to use the duck whatever package that I believe came from the Knative controller or something like that, that contained the structure. And that I believe KubeBuilder now has the structure as part of KubeBuilder. I think that's just a reference that Dustin is talking about.
Yep, it's my understanding that status.conditions is now part of KubeBuilder. They're just built in as part of like a default configuration, if you will.
And I don't mean that the KubeBuilder will put it there, but it has the structure available for you now.
Okay. Gotcha. Anyways, I have got the drop for a customer call, but if I need to hop on or something or answer some questions offline from a consumer perspective, I'm happy to do that. So Helen, you can reach out to me or if I miss anything.
Thanks for being here and providing that additional context, Dustin. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, thanks, Dustin.
Yep, thank you.
So we've spent quite a chunk of time on this discussion topic. I would like to move on to other items. Where do we want to leave this particular item? Are there any action items moving forward, or is this something that still needs to be discussed at length?
I mean, one angle we can take on this is to do an explore around what it would take to provide a execution environment there. Explore this suggestion.
I'd like to see us.
We could write a proposal.
Yeah, I'd like us to. I'd like to see a proposal, maybe in a more fuller form about what are the possible approaches, and maybe alongside that, I see multiple places where the YTT execution environment, like the inline function style thing, is appropriate amongst our several projects. And I'd like to see if we can figure out what is the kind of a user experience around those usages would be, so that we have a consistent way of kind of dealing with some of this stuff. And I think that will also give us a better understanding of, should we be using this stuff in this various places, or maybe we'll also uncover other places where we should be using this kind of a thing.
So if I'm hearing you right, it's extracting out the evaluate Starlark functionality out of YTT, like exploring well, if we could do that, and now the Carvel suite could benefit from having that capability in multiple tools, CAP being one, what could that look like?
I'm not sure if you meant like extracting like code-wise. I actually think that the current YTT packages are usable as is for this kind of a case.
Sure.
What I was maybe leaning towards more is just trying to think where are various places within our tools that would benefit from this break the glass functionality, right? And like, for example, this would be a possibility. Then like potentially more advanced rebasing would be a possibility. Image package copy with rename would be one. There might be more.
Before we go in that deep, can we check with our users what they need before we provide this YTT functionality? It can be easy, it can be hard, but in the end, as Dustin was saying, he doesn't want to write StarLark if he can avoid it. So in the end, I think we should focus this also on the users, because they are going to be the ones that will benefit more from this. And if we think that this could be a good thing to add internally to make CAP like do other things and just extract some logic that we currently have in Go to StarLark, it might be a good idea. But I think we should separate those two concerns and see if what our users need really require an YTT execution environment here.
I think there's a balance. I think we need to be very conscious, because I also don't want to end up with like 5 different ways how you can wait on. And now we have this, well, we've actually have a very fragmented experience of how to wait on things, right? And this is also like true, for example, like within image package, we were talking about having like multiple different ways to match things. K-build also struggles with this problem because it's effectively trying to, again, encode more advanced cases in YAML. So it just becomes a mess. And so there's a balance to me between what would be the ideal for the user. And so I think like the 95% cases condition, it's ideal, done deal. But we're not talking about that common case. We're talking about that advanced user, or at least advanced use case, if not advanced user, right? And I'm not sure we should be optimizing that 5% case compared to like just providing that break glass functionality and saying, well, if you are in that 5%, you got to put in a little bit more effort in actually describing that, because it's such a special case.
Any other comments on this before we move on? Sounds like what the consensus really is just writing a proposal and then going from there on just different possible approaches. Good to move on. I'm actually gonna just skip over the triage help for now because I want to get to Tyler and go over him. I want to make sure we have time for him. So Tyler, if you want to just go over what it is that you're looking for here and just a background.
Sure, yeah. I'm gonna talk real fast for about 5 or 10 minutes and then see what falls out of it. So what I'm hoping to get out of this conversation is, is YTT a potential technology that Cardinal Health should look at for this current use case that is not necessarily the standard YTT use case? So a little bit about me. My role is application security engineer. This might not be the conversation that you expect to have with that kind of person. My background is I spent 2.5 years in our innovation lab doing application development. One of the things that fell out of like the DevOps revolution is that a a lot of organizations gave app teams latitude to go off and do their own thing and determine their own patterns on how to do build, test, deploy, run. We did that as an organization here, and we found out that we learned a lot of things. We also found out that, you know, as an application security engineer now looking at it, we've got 150 app teams that are doing everything a little bit different, and that sucks. You know, I want to be able to have a single extension point to be able to go provide them with, you know, here's this new tooling that does this type of scanning or whatever. So one of the larger initiatives that Cardinal is doing right now is trying to standardize build, test, run across the organization. You know, Cardinal, we have a strong relationship with Pivotal and VMware. We adopted PCF very early, or Tanzu, I guess now. We've used Concourse for build for a long time. So I don't know how familiar everyone is with Concourse, but that is currently the path forward for our build tools or our thing doer. It uses YAML as configuration. And actually, do you mind if I steal a share? Disabled participant, that's fine. So there's a Concourse, or there's an issue in their GitHub.
You should be able to share
cool.
now. Yep.
Thank you. So this issue was opened in the Concourse GitHub a while ago. That was, you know, hey, we've got a whole bunch of pipeline YAMLs that are running around. They're hundreds and hundreds of lines long, and everybody is doing things a little bit differently, right? So I've got an app team, I've got 60 different services. You know, I don't have time to go reconcile all of the different configurations for their build. I've got multiple app teams that I'm now managing, et cetera, et cetera. So there was a proposal that was thrown out here that was like, how do we break this up and templatize things so that, you know, your deploy jobs all use this template, your, you know, smoke test jobs all use this template. There's been some back and forth on this. I don't know, Vito threw it in their like V10 roadmap a year ago. I also know they've been very busy trying to get to Kubernetes native. So like, I get it, they haven't had time to work on this templatizing function. The basis of how a pipeline actually looks is kind of here. So you have these things that are tasks, you have these things that are jobs, you have what's considered a resource, which is, it could point at Git, it could point at, you know, a Slack webhook, it could point at a PCF environment for a deployment. You define tasks, which are the set of steps that you walk through to do a thing, right? So as you can imagine, a lot of these things are going to be common across a lot of different projects. I've got a Spring Boot microservice, I'm pushing it into PCF. The deploy is going to be relatively simple between all of them. So we're trying to figure out a way to enable an internal repository to hold all of the potential configuration and drive that across the organization. So YTT has come up a couple of times as a templatizing tool. And before I go and do a bunch of spike work and try and proof of concept this, I wanted to get the thoughts of the community, right? One thing that is a major concern, right? We have probably 150 different app teams. That's just a guess. I'm an application security engineer. I should probably know that, and I don't, which is scary. So everybody is going to have a couple of different requirements. And as we're building this thing out, we're going to need to do it as an inner source type of product. So we're going to need to have tech leads from different app teams coming and pull requesting into this centralized project. And, you know, coming from an application engineer background, being able to run a unit test on a pull request that then pushes a status to your branch, and you've got branch protection that says, no, you can't merge, is going to be very important to us. So I actually ran into an issue in Helm, in a Helm chart just yesterday, that kind of describes what I potentially foresee happening if we use YTT to do this. And, you know, I'll preface this all by saying, I haven't looked into YTT more than like a half hour of Googling and looking through your GitHub. And I crashed the meeting on Tuesday and Nancy reached out to me. So that's my background and what I understand of the product. So I was deploying the Keycloak Helm chart yesterday. I threw a really long name on it, right? So this is a value. It's going to be in your values, or, you know, and if we templatize concourse the same way, I foresee us using a values file of some kind that then gets populated into all of your templates, and YTT jams it all together for me into a pipeline.yaml. So the way their chart was set up is in their service, they use this helper function keycloak full name, which does a trunk, right? Because apparently, I don't know, something. And I'm new to Kubernetes. I've been using it like a month and a half. So I don't understand what that's actually doing. In their ingress, when they point at their backend, they point their service name at something else. And guess what happened when I used a really long name that got truncated? Well, cool. My service got truncated. My ingress pointed at this, and now it's all broken. And so I want to be able to, you know, if we take this pattern and move it over to a potential concourse YTT templating type of thing, I want to be able to run a pull request that says, when I give you this value, assert that this YAML output test case is what the templatization actually outputs. So again, lots of words. I'll stop sharing. Thoughts?
Some digestion right now, I believe.
I'll jump in if nobody else.
So for what it's worth, one thing I'll throw out initially, like the answer of YTT is not the tool for this is completely acceptable. If the answer is go write your own templatizer, use Go YAML and move on, I'm 100% cool with that. I just thought, you know, I would love to reuse community tools when and where I can and contribute when and where I can. So thanks. Sorry, Dimitri.
I was just gonna say I'll jump in if nobody else has, but feel free to interrupt. So just maybe to unpack, there's a few things that you're kind of talking about. You're talking about concourse pipelines, you're talking about Kubernetes configuration, and you're talking about maybe asserting on some values for that, you know, the YAML that comes out of somewhere, right? So I'm not sure if you're kind of trying to all solve once, or if there's some kind of an interconnection between. So maybe I'll start with the most concrete one that you mentioned is asserting on the value on some kind of YAML that popped out of somewhere. So let's assume for a second that we have no idea where that YAML is popping out from. We just have YAML. We got to assert some values, right? So YTT can help you with that. There is a feature called overlays. And typically, overlays are meant to modify things in the YAML. But there is a functionality in overlays to say, let me assert on a particular value. So you could write some overlays that say, I'm just gonna make sure that some particular value is there, right? And you know, feel free to kind of ping us on Slack if you want to have some more examples of that or things like that, right? So that's kind of one way to, well, that's one way to do that one particular validation thing. Maybe then to step back. So you were working with some Helm template. Was part of your question a question around should I use YTT to template the things instead of Helm template? Okay, so that was not it. Okay, so sorry. Yeah. So the only part of that question was how to assert. Now, what was the bit about the concourse? How does that play into this whole thing? You're just saying that because I'm running concourse, that's how it's in the picture, and I want to be able to report back the status to GitHub or something like that, right?
So concourse is the problem statement. They define job configuration in YAML, and if I had one pulled up, I could show you. But for a general microservice pattern where you're doing multiple stage deployments and you're doing smoke tests and unit tests and all of this stuff, that YAML file gets to be 8 or 100,000 lines long.
Yeah.
Where a lot of that stuff is shared components across multiple projects, or it should be. Mm-hmm. So that's our goal, is to, instead of having each project own a 1,000-line YAML file, is to have a single central repository that can then you provide as your project. Here's a values.yaml or a concourse-values.yaml Take this generator project, given those values, templatize everything together, and output the 1,000-line YAML. Yep.
Okay, so the Helm thing was really more of an example what the same thing is happening in Kubernetes. Got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so that was an example of this is what I don't want to see merged into our repo, is where it's broken for this use case. I want to be able to assert that on the pull request and make sure that that kind of broken code doesn't get into our repo.
So maybe a follow-up question to that would be, so assuming that you're the one maintaining this, let's say, I don't know, maybe you have this set of templates that generates you a basic pipeline with the unit test, smoke test, whatever it is, right?
Yep.
I'm assuming that, you're going to go and try to convince a bunch of teams to say, you know what, just roll with this configuration. You're going to love it. You don't have to maintain all of the stuff yourself, right? So really the author for that configuration is you, right? And so then the question, I guess, is, well, if you are the author, right, and, let's say using YTT for that stuff, right, I would imagine that you're probably going to be a lot more conscious about like not adding code, like, trim the random name over here or over there, right? So I'm not sure if you actually would benefit from kind of testing the end result in kind of I don't know if this was more of like a service level example or something like that, but I would imagine that you might have like a dedicated test suite that says, let me run YTT with this particular set of data values and just kind of assert on the value for your own use, not for the use against what kind of the people populate in. So it's kind of like, just like you would ship any software project, you might have some tests for it, right? But they kind of stay internal to you. They're not really kind of shipped off into other places, right? And so I don't know if kind of the part of what you're describing is that the end, the project team, they would just be giving you a set of data values, right? They wouldn't be giving you the rendered YAML file, right? Or
so in the end state, yes. One thing I want to touch on is actually rolling this out is not going to be convincing app teams so much as it is like a CTO edict. Mm-hmm. So that's going on, and to hit the kind of timelines that we're hoping to hit, our team or even a combination of teams are not going to be able to accomplish it alone. We're going to need, leads from app teams to pull request into this centralized project and say, this is the thing that we need it to now do for us to comply.
I see.
So and that's where the testing thing comes in, that, if we've got multiple pull requests coming in from all of these people across the organization that we don't know, we can't trust them. And I also don't have time to go manually validate them. I mean,
okay.
I do, but I'm salary.
You were talking more about how do you, the PRs are actually coming in for the modification of templates that ultimately the teams will be using to generate the concourse config.
Correct. Yeah, and that's where I said YTT is not the answer, is potentially an answer.
Yeah, I mean, depending. So this actually, maybe this is something that you can circle back with us on Slack, given I'm guessing we're getting closer to the end of the meeting, but this sounds like a question of how is it, what are the different approaches to testing YTT templates, just in general, right? And so there's actually a few answers. YTT overlays is just one of those answers, may not actually be maybe appropriate in your case, something like that. So I think, I think it'll probably be better to spin up a thread and just kind of throw in a few possibilities there and see kind of where we go from there.
Yeah, and that sounds great. And if I'll throw a comment after this meeting, and if you can give me like a half dozen of them, I might spike it over the next couple of weeks and come back in whenever the next community, office hours is and discuss it further. Cool.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Tyler, for sharing that, and we'll take care of it on Slack, hopefully. We have 6 minutes left to go over these triage items. I'm gonna share my screen again. Okay, so I'm just going to start with the first one. Does that sound good? All right, who wants to speak to this? Anyone? Doesn't seem like.
I remember we talked about this previously. So I can give like a high level overview of what this issue is describing. So currently in CAP, there is a feature where you can specify a directory structure as input, and it will, using that directory structure, deploy applications to the cluster using like the name of the files in that directory structure as the name of the app that's deployed. If I remember correctly, I haven't read this closely. And so this is a proposal to add a similar functionality to YTT, where you would give YTT as input a directory structure, like that example. And YTT would template each directory independently. And then the outputs of that would be independent of each directory. So we did talk about this one pretty extensively at a community meeting in the past. I think the notes from that meeting just did not get captured here. There were a few highlights that I remember that I'm happy to like note take here. But if there's more to talk about, we can also do that right now.
Is our goal here to find the next step for this issue or something else?
I'm not sure who put the triage help in. So this was moved from Monday's community meeting because we didn't have time to go over that section. So I moved it here. And I'm not sure if it was Aaron that had put the triage help in here, if he could give more context as to what the goals were.
I was part of the pair that added this.
Okay.
The objective of this one was just to come up with some next steps. At the end of the GitHub issue, it said, we'll bring this up with our, I don't know, with our PM or with the community or something. And I just wanted I wanted to close the loop, really.
Okay, seems like the loop might not be closed.
I'm happy to capture the items that I remember from the previous discussion in this issue. I can take that as an action item.
Okay, great.
Thanks, Carrie.
Thanks, Carrie.
I guess we haven't really talked too much about this kind of like, where do we, I think this is something that even has come up in the recent contributor meeting about like kind of a formalizing of an issue, and where at some point like becomes maybe accepted to be included in the product or something else. So I don't know if this is a good example of that because it's been sitting for a while. For me, at least personally, I think this this issue is probably good to put in a bucket for wouldn't want to implement, but I remember vaguely from our previous discussion that there was more questions and discussion to be had about it. So I'm not sure how might be worth kind of dedicating some time to confirm where we want to go with this.
So it sounds like we might have to move this to Monday's meeting and continue the discussion then.
I think maybe once the items that we talked about previously are captured in this issue, then if there's more discussion to be had out of that, it can come up here again.
Okay. That works. We have no time left. So I'll move the last two for sure to Monday's meeting, and we can touch on those then. All right, so that concludes the first edition of our office hours. Once again, we have these now every second and fourth Thursday of the month at 11:30 a.m. Pacific time, 2:30 p.m. Eastern time. We also hold our Carvel community meetings every Monday at the same time, 11:30 a.m. Pacific time, 2:30 p.m. Eastern time. We invite you to attend either or both. We would love to have you participate and help you in any way, use Carvel or contribute and join the community. So with that, until next time, we'll see you then.